And let's see here. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As you know, my name is Lacey Ballinger, and I'm the Director of Collections and Exhibits here at the Tallahassee Museum. Thank you all for joining us here again this week for Sipping with Science, our museum mixology lecture series, and virtual lecture series held here at the museum every Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The purpose of this series is to provide a variety of lecture series topics and a virtual realm, including cocktails and crime, sipping with science, and a toast to history. And I hope each of you, if possible, if you're here in Tallahassee, had a chance to go by Madison Social or Curbside to Go this week. They're offered 2 signature cocktails, steak bite and rattlesnake, in honoring our speaker this week. A portion of those proceeds will be going to the museum, so I hope you're able to run by there. And if you weren't, as you know, we have a virtual tip jar which I can share with you if you're interested. I'm sure most of you have already donated to that, so I appreciate that. Tonight we'll be having Dr. Timothy Colston talk to us about amphibian and reptiles of Ethiopia. Dr. Colston just recently, well, not recently, actually it's in 2018, joined the Rakita Lab at FSU in July of 2018 to study the genetic basis of evolutionary novelties in complex, oh, my voice is not in sync. I'm not sure what to do about that. Sorry, Phyllis, I don't know how to sync up my voice and whatever's going on. Anyway, Dr. Colston, Timothy Colston, joined the FSU Rakita Lab in 2018 to study the genetic basis of evolutionary novelties in complex venom systems and how they drive biological diversification. Sorry, I'm having to read this. I cannot memorize everything he has been able to do in his career. He is very successful, and I am going to, how do I say this? I'm going to edit this down a little bit because he is very accomplished. He recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship at George Washington University. He is an evolutionary biologist with a strong background in phylogenetics, host microbiome interactions, and has extensive fieldwork experience in South America and Ethiopia. He earned his Ph.D. in biology from the University of Mississippi and holds master's and undergraduate degrees in zoology from the University of Oklahoma. And let me tell you, that is very much edited down. He is a very successful individual, and I think you guys are going to be fascinated about what he has to say. And so please enjoy his lecture over the next hour. And I'm already fascinated by the photos he has up. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Colston.
All right, Lacey, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Warming introduction. And I'm just going to put it out there that while I have enjoyed my time at FSU in the Rakita Lab, I'm actually now at Gator. So I'm recently accepted a position at the University of Florida in their biology department. And I'm also affiliated with the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. So we're still in Tallahassee. We're not going anywhere because of coronavirus, working remotely. But I'm at UF now, no longer at FSU. But I am, thank you all for joining. I hope that everyone is enjoying a nice cocktail of their choice. But this is a really exciting event. I've always been really passionate about museums and outreach, and museums and collection research are very central and fundamental to my own research. I started off as a volunteer at a museum at the University of Oklahoma, and that led me down the path of the research that I'm doing. Just a little more to add to the brief introduction, the wonderful introduction that Lacey gave. I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I'm primarily interested in evolutionary processes that impact diversification. So that's what brought me to FSU to study venom evolution and the impact of venom evolving and how that impacts diversification of reptiles. Prior to that, I was really interested in how microbes and microbiomes impact reptile diversification. But the real through line is really I'm a amphibian and reptile nut. So hopefully, if you guys have questions or anything, feel free to use the chat box. This is my first Zoom public lecture like this, so bear with me. But I'll try to answer your questions as they come in. But I want to talk to you today about a place that's very near and dear to my heart. Ever since I was a child, I was fascinated with Ethiopia. I don't really have a pinpoint of why that was. There were several books that my parents gave me that were about Ethiopia, and that might have sparked it. But I was very fortunate as a Ph.D. student to be able to get a Fulbright fellowship to do a residency, a Fulbright, for about a year-long stint in Ethiopia from 2012 to 2013. And that really sparked the future direction of my career, which I hope will continue to involve Ethiopia going forward. So I have active research there, active collaborations, and it's really, next to the US, I consider it one of my second homes. So jumping into the lecture here, let's see. Okay, I've got to click on it. So I'm going to give you sort of a background of Ethiopia, what some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not be familiar with, talk about the herpetofaunal diversity there, so the reptiles and amphibians that occur there. Then I'm going to focus in on some of my ongoing research there, and then kind of summarize and take some questions. But again, if you have any questions as we're going through it, feel free to use the chat box or just jump in and ask me some questions. So Ethiopia is a country located in the Horn of Africa. You may have heard about it recently. It's the seat of the African Union. So much like the EU, the European Union, Africa has its own union of nations, and the headquarters are in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And then also Mr. Tedros Adhanom is the leader of the World Health Organization right now currently, and he is Ethiopian. He was their previous director of health within Ethiopia, and he's currently the leader of the WHO. And so he's been very in the public eye dealing with the COVID-19 situation, the global pandemic. So Ethiopia has always been a regional power in the Horn of Africa. It rivaled the great dynasties of Egypt ever since the 10th century BCE. So you may have read about many things in history books about Ethiopia being a very important place for a very long time. In addition to that, Ethiopia is considered the center place for the origins of human culture and human evolution and diversification in general. So Lucy is one of the earliest hominid fossils, and many of the earliest hominid fossils are coming out of Ethiopia. So people, we have our origins, the human species has our origins in Ethiopia. Currently, there's about 90 million people that live in Ethiopia. But the through line that often comes up whenever I mention that I work in Ethiopia is that people are like, oh, I remember Ethiopia because of all of the human rights campaigns in the 80s and 90s. And like, I've heard about famine there, or I've donated money there. And oftentimes people have not heard much else. So I'm really hoping to expand your knowledge of this beautiful, wonderful country beyond that. But one of the key reasons why Ethiopia has been such a wonderful partner to the US is the Horn of Africa is generally considered a fairly unstable region with multiple states that are in turmoil oftentimes. So Somalia, South Sudan, these regionally not very stable governments. And Ethiopia has for a long time been considered a very stable government within an unstable region. So you've probably heard a lot of the news about Ethiopia because of that reason, and they've been a partner for the US for a long time because of that. The Ethiopia, one thing that I'm going to highlight, it is considered the birthplace of human culture. It's extremely diverse. There are over 109 languages spoken within the country from 90 different tribes of people. Some of the most infamous peoples are the Afar traders in the north and the Amhara Highlanders, which are often considered like the traditional ruling class of Ethiopia. So the Solomonic kings, Haile Selassie, who actually birthed the origin of Rastafarianism. So if you're into reggae culture, that's the origins of that. The tribes in the Omo Valley are infamous for their coverage of their elaborate ways that they dress and decorate themselves. And then the Oromo people of the highlands are known worldwide for their amazing coffee cultivation, among other things. In the southeast, you have the Somali region, and so the Somali nomads that have ran salt trades for thousands of years. And again, I said, actually, I should correct my my slide here, 82 tribes. It's over 90 tribes and over 90 languages, but it's over 109 languages now that are fully recognized. So why is there such this diversity in this relatively not particularly large country? Well, this is largely due to the topographic diversity of the country. And so if you see this topographic map here, you see that within Ethiopia, you have a huge elevational change. So from 130 meters below sea level here in the Danakil Depression, all the way up to nearly 5,000 meters above sea level up here in the highlands. So 50% of all mountains within the African continent by area are contained within Ethiopia. And then you also have the Great Rift Valley, which is dividing these two giant mountain ranges here. So the arid zones here in the lowlands have less than 90 growing days per year. And so in the Afar region here, and then the Ogaden region here, you have these vast deserts. And then these highlands are bordered by savannas, and there's grasslands in the mountain regions. So in the montane and lowland regions, there's vast forests. And so this creates a lot of not only topographic and topological diversity with the mountains, but also diversity of like livable habitat, basically. And most of Ethiopia's population, so this is a map of population density where the darker colors indicate more people live there. Excuse me, most of Ethiopia's population lives above 2,000 meters elevation. So that's 6,500 feet. So within the United States, to put that into context, only Colorado and Wyoming have mean elevations that are above 6,500 feet. Basically, when you land in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where it's the largest city in Ethiopia, where the majority of the Ethiopian, a large portion of the Ethiopian population live, you're landing above Denver. So most people in Ethiopia live actually at very high elevations. And so Ethiopians, Abyssinians, have often been referred to as the Highlanders. Why is this? Well, so this map that I'm showing you here is showing you the mean annual temperature, and then also the mean annual precipitation, where the red colors mean hotter temperature and the blue colors mean more precipitation. And so basically where it's very hot and very dry, which is not very good for agriculture or for people to live, there's not many people that live there. Most of the people live in these highland regions that are indicated by cooler temperatures and larger amounts of rainfall. Again, I mentioned this topographic diversity. So from 130 meters below sea level to nearly 5,000 meters above, 50% of all African mountains by area are contained within Ethiopia. You get these beautiful landscapes. And this is what's led to the diversity of peoples that live there. So there's a lot of disconnect and continuity between the different tribes because they're separated by mountains that are very habitable, where lots of people can live and grow and create agriculture and establish communities, but then they're separated by these very inhospitable regions where few people live. And so this leads to division of cultural practices and languages and leads to higher diversity. Just to further point out the importance of Ethiopia topographically and geographically. So Ethiopia is considered part of the Eastern Afro-Montane World Biodiversity Hotspot. And so these are in the Afro-Montane region is indicated here in red. And whenever you look at Africa as a whole, Ethiopia as a country contains the largest portion of the Afro-Montane World Biodiversity Hotspot, largest portion of any country. So I need to define what a World Biodiversity Hotspot is. And what a biodiversity hotspot is, actually, the definition is an area that has a high number of species that are found nowhere else, and a high number of those species that are also under threat for various reasons, whether that's habitat destruction, change due to agricultural practices, or overharvesting or exploitation. So recently, to bring it back home, the southeastern coastal plains, here where we are in Florida, were classified as a world biodiversity hotspot because the high number of species that we have here, primarily plants, but some reptiles also, that are found nowhere else that are actually under threat. As far as from a biogeographic perspective, I know this is a complex figure, but basically these arrows are different hypotheses for the origins of different animals and plants, where they evolved and how they might have spread from the African continent into the Eurasia and around the world. And basically the take home that I want to show you here is whether the hypothesis is the origin is in Central Africa, West Africa, or even Southern Africa. All of these hypotheses have to lead to a path of dispersal that goes through Ethiopia to be able to enter Eurasia. So there's one hypothesis that suggests that some West African species actually colonized what are now no longer present islands off the coast of West Africa, and then they might have entered Europe that way. But for the vast majority of species, the hypothesis, including the origin of human species, is that there was some origin somewhere in Central or South Africa, and dispersal occurred through Ethiopia onto the Arabian Peninsula and into Eurasia. So it's a very important region biogeographically, one of the regions that I'm so interested in it. Again, this just highlights this. So several different hypotheses of African species, how they might have colonized Asia, Eurasia, and beyond, even making their way all the way to Australia. But all three of the different scenarios have species crossing through Ethiopia and having to use Ethiopia as a dispersal route. Moving on to some of the fauna of Ethiopia. So 30% of all the fauna and flora in Ethiopia are endemic to Ethiopia. So they're found nowhere else in the world but Ethiopia. And then some regions, and when I use the term regions, you can equate that to states in the United States, because Ethiopia is divided up, into 12 organized political regions or zones, and they're much like states. Some of those political zones have as much as 60% endemism. So 60% of all the plants and animals that are found there are found nowhere else in the world, which is really incredible. So just a quick recap of the background that I've given you as the country. So Ethiopia is very well known as the birthplace of human culture. There are current and past regional political importance dating all the way back to the ancient Egyptians and all the way up to present day, with the leader of the World Health Organization being Ethiopian. It's a very biogeographically important area. It contains 50% of all the mountains in Africa. And one thing I didn't point on is that it's considered the rainmaker for the Horn of Africa. So the mountains in the south of Ethiopia, due to the weathering patterns and their position, much of all of the rainfall in the Horn of Africa is dependent upon those mountains being there. So if those mountains had not uplifted, or in the past prior to the uplift of those mountains, the Horn of Africa would be much like the Sahara Desert. So it would be a very, very dry place. And then as a country, over 30% of all the animals and plants that are found there are found nowhere else. They're endemic to Ethiopia. And this is amazing because now I've overlaid Ethiopia onto a map of the United States to depict that this country is only a little bit larger than the state of Texas. And even though Texas is a huge state, they don't really quite have the numbers of endemic species that match up to Ethiopia. So if we make the comparison, Texas, again, leads the US in endemism and diversity, along with California and Florida. There's 225 species of Herpetofauna found in Texas, about 150 reptiles and 70 amphibians. They have 10% endemism. Some of this endemism is calculated based on what's known as a subspecies. So it's not even at the species level, but within species, they calculate that there are endemic populations that are only found in Texas. One other thing I would point out, Texas, as we know, is located in North America, and North America is perhaps the most well-researched and well-documented region of the entire world, with some exceptions in Europe. So moving on to actual Ethiopian amphibian and reptile diversity, I'll talk about the amphibians first. They're pretty cool. Hopefully we've got lots of frog lovers out there. Amphibians have the highest endemism of any terrestrial vertebrate group in Ethiopia. So 40% of the frogs, toads, and caecilians, I'll talk about them in a minute, occur in Ethiopia and nowhere else. The greatest diversity of amphibians is found in the highlands. This makes sense. The highlands are very cool and very wet, as I mentioned to you. There's about 65, 70 species currently described from 15 families. Definitely underdocumented diversity. I'm going to, the next portion of this talk is going to go family by family and talk about those individual species. And sometimes you may see a range map down here underneath the picture. And if there's a red circle, it'll indicate where they occur. And so caecilians are a family of amphibians that are legless and very ancient lineage. So that you can think of them as sort of like legless salamanders or Amphioma that we have here in Florida. You can see the big two-toed Amphioma down in the Apalachicola National Forest sometimes. So Ethiopia has one family, the Caecilidae, and there's one endemic genus and species. So this is it. I've actually never seen one in the wild. I've seen pictures where I've been. People have shown me pictures on their cell phones that they've snapped and thought that it was a snake. But so Silva Cecilia grandisone, pictured here is a picture by the late Malcolm Logren, who was a infamous Ethiopian herpetologist. And they're known from this area of Ethiopia here in the west, right here. But there also are anecdotal reports here in the southeast in the Bale Mountains. And if you remember, throughout my talk, I'll mention the Bale Mountains over and over again. It's an area that I've spent a lot of time working, and it's very important for the endemic species in Ethiopia. But not much is known about these caecilians. They spend most of their life underground, only come above ground during very, very heavy rains, and so it's hard to find them. Moving on to the frogs. So the Arthroleptidae is a very large family throughout Africa, very speciose. In Ethiopia, there are 6 described species, but 3 of those are endemic. So these are basically the forest frogs or tree frogs. So tree frogs that are very common here in Tallahassee that you see on your in your gardens and on your front porches. These frogs fill that niche in Ethiopia. So they're very widespread, but they have the highest diversity again in the highlands. These cute guys here are the Ethiopian burrowing tree frogs that are very, very common throughout the entire country. The Breviceptidae, so these are called the rain frogs. There was a YouTube video in the last few years from a South African Breviceps that makes an incredibly cute call whenever it squeals. So you might have seen that. There's one species and one endemic genus that occurs in Ethiopia. Again, it's only known from the Bale Mountains and habitat like this. This is a picture of one. These are direct developing frogs, so they need very moist, very wet habitat. And basically, the frogs, from what we understand, very little is known about their biology. They lay eggs, and instead of going through a tadpole stage, the eggs hatch as little miniature, totally metamorphosed frogs. But they lay these eggs underneath logs and leaf litter, and sometimes rocks in this type of very moist Erica forest habitat, only in the Bale Mountains. But as people expand and move higher up into the mountains, people collect all of the logs and driftwood to burn their fires to heat their homes. So this frog is being considered for protection because of the fact that their habitat is being destroyed. Not so much the forest itself, but there's just very little habitat for them to reproduce in. So the Bufonidae, which are the toads. So we have toads here in the same family. The American toads and the Fowler's toads are very common all around Tallahassee. Ethiopia has 14 species, 4 of which are endemic. They also have 2 endemic genera, and they're very widespread. Again, the highest, or opposed to frogs, the highest diversity is actually in the lowlands, but there are several specialists that are found only in Ethiopian highlands. Conraoidae, these are the Goliath frogs. These are the largest frogs in the world. The West African species can get massive. It can get several pounds, and it's just a massive frog. In Ethiopia, they're known as slippery frogs. They're very hard to grab. They live in rivers and streams that look like this, where there's actually fast flowing water, which isn't depicted by this photo very well, but they take shelter under these massive boulders. So they're very hard to catch. When you see one and you're out at night and you want to try to go and grab it, it usually quickly dives under one of these massive rocks that you would need a truck to remove. So the Dicerglossidae, there's 1 species found in Ethiopia. This family has its highest diversity in West Africa. In West Africa, these are called the fork-tongued or crown bullfrogs. They're pretty infamous. You may have seen them on nature documentaries and things. They're similar to African pixie frogs, which is actually a different family, but these guys get pretty big, and they're very cannibalistic. So they'll just eat anything that fits in their mouth, including members of their same species, if it's small enough to fit in their mouth. Within Ethiopia, these have pretty limited distribution just in the west at low elevations. The shovel-nosed frogs, so Hemisus, there's 2 species, one of which is endemic in Ethiopia. The endemic species, again, is found in the highlands. The other species is very widespread all throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And these guys are great. In the US, we have toads that are called spadefoot toads that do something similar, but they use their hind legs to dig burrows very quickly. These guys actually use that pointy snout and dig burrows into the ground really fast. And so that's why they're called shovel-nosed frogs. The Hyperoilid family is very diverse in Ethiopia. There's 12 species, 3 of which are endemic, and 1 endemic genus. This frog I'm circling right here, so the Paracasina. This particular species actually is fairly toxic. That's why it has these bright orange flashes warning things that might eat it, that it has toxic secretions in its skin. And these are called collectively the reed frogs or bush frogs or banana frogs. They're often found in agriculture where there's a lot of water, things are very wet. These actually have their highest diversity in the lowlands, but again, this species here, Paracasina, there's 2 endemic species only found in Ethiopia, and they're strictly highland specialists. 1 species of microhylids exist in Ethiopia. These are the narrow-mouthed frogs. We have a species here in Tallahassee, Gastrophryne carolinensis. They make a very distinctive call. Microhylids sound the same everywhere in the world. Their call is very similar. In Ethiopia, they have a very limited distribution just in the extreme south in the Somali region, and they're only known from a couple of specimens. So they're not very common at all, but in other areas of Africa, this is a very, very common frog. This is Ericobatrachus. This family is endemic to Ethiopia, only found in the Bale Mountains. This is a type of torrid frog that is a highland specialist. They're only in very, very fast-flowing water, near fast-flowing water in the Ethiopian mountains in the Bale region. So these were originally described in the 1980s. They're found amongst waterfalls, clinging to foliage near waterfalls. Very little is known even about their reproduction. And this is a species that has not been seen in many, many years by very many individuals. We have puddle frogs and then also African clawed frogs. So this one here on the right, there's 2 species in Ethiopia. One is endemic. This is in the genus Xenopus. So for those of you that follow much about medical research, Xenopus or African clawed frogs are very, very popular, not only in the pet trade, but also in research. So they're actually an invasive species anywhere in the world because they've been exported and bred by the thousands for science. So they reproduce very, very well in the lab, and you can watch them grow, you know, in an introductory biology lab, you can watch them metamorphose. So it's an important species for medical research and just general biology education, but Ethiopia has 2 of these. The rocket frogs, so Tychidinidae, these frogs are basically analogous to our ranid frogs here in the US. So things that you think of like bullfrogs, leopard frogs, green frogs, very common things that occupy a wide variety of habitats. In Ethiopia, it's a different family, but as you can see, they look very similar. The greatest diversity of these are also found in the highlands, but you certainly have many species that occur in the lowlands. They're practically ubiquitous across the country. And then finally, 3 of the less represented species within Ethiopia, Pyxocephalidae. These are the largemouth frogs. So I'm circling one here on the right. I don't know if you can see it. These are the frogs that you see on the nature documentaries really commonly eating other frogs because they've just got really big mouths. And then there's 2 species of true frogs, the ranids, which are bullfrogs and leopard frogs, and then 1 species of racophorid. So these frogs have higher diversity in Asia, but they create these big foam nests that are used to protect their eggs. So there's 1 species that occurs in Ethiopia. So regarding amphibian conservation in Ethiopia, there's a number of species that have not been seen in almost 2 decades now. Only 50 species are listed on the IUCN Red List. So these abbreviations, 3 of them are considered critically endangered, 3 are endangered, 4 are considered vulnerable. But this is only 20% of all the species that occur in Ethiopia. So the largest number of species just don't have any status or haven't actually been properly assessed. One of the main reasons for this is human expansion and human encroachment on habitat. So I've got 2 pictures here of the Bale Mountains region where, again, this is where the highest amount of amphibian diversity is. And you can see here's nice pristine Erica forest that's abutting right up to agriculture that is spreading into the forest. And then in this lower picture here, you can see all of this that has been burned. This was in 2015. The local people that were moving into the national park, which should not have any people inhabiting it, basically just set fire to the forest because once it's burned, they feel that there's nothing to recover. And also burning fresh forest means that grass comes up first, and it's easier to feed their livestock off of grass than trees and shrubs, which typically occupy the forest. Says, at what point are they determined to be extinct? So that differs, but basically the IUCN has different committees and steering groups that specialize with a particular species. So in addition to being part of the chameleon specialist group within Ethiopia, I'm part of the boa and python specialist group for the IUCN. And so that group makes a determination if there is a species that hasn't been seen in a certain amount of time, and there's been a certain amount of effort gone into trying to recover and locate that species. There are certain criteria that have to be met for actually declaring a species extinct. And that does vary a little bit by what the taxa is. So if it's something, for example, large like a tiger, of a particular tiger population, they're more likely to be seen than something that's, very small and very remote, like a particular fish in the ocean. So there's a different amount of search effort that has to be applied before it's described as extinct, and that's sort of up to the different steering committees. But really good question. So moving on to the reptile diversity, and I'm going to take a quick pause and a drink here. Reptile diversity in Ethiopia is exactly opposite of amphibian diversity. The highest diversity for reptiles is found in the lowland arid zones, so where it's hot and dry. That's what reptiles like. Amphibians like it wet and cool. Reptiles like it hot and dry. There's about 200 described species, 20 of which are endemic. But again, there's certainly underdocumented diversity within Ethiopia. And so this is just a fun photo that I like. This was my first forest cobra that I ever caught in the Bedele region of Ethiopia. And so this was just a fun find for me. There's one family of crocodiles that occur in Ethiopia. So the Nile crocodile, it's actually the East African Nile crocodile. So it's a different species than the West African Nile. The testudines, so turtles and tortoises, there's 4 families. Lizards, there's 11 families, about 108 species. About 5 of those are endemic. But one of the interesting things is 40% of the endemism within lizards is from the Somali arid zone. And so this is a zone that is not a political region. This is an ecological zone that is shared with neighboring Somalia and Somaliland, which is a different regional political unit than the country of Somalia. And so if you actually consider just the Somali arid zone that Ethiopia shares with that, then the endemism of these lizards is actually much, much higher. Within snakes, there's 10 families represented by about 90 species, and there's 9 endemic species. And again, with the snakes, the highest amount of diversity is in the savannas and the deserts. The East African Nile crocodile, as I mentioned, is found pretty much throughout any large river body of water in Ethiopia, throughout the Great Lakes, or the Great Rift Valley Lakes region. The subspecies found in Ethiopia is endemic, only found there. And it's widespread again in all the major rivers and within the lowlands. An interesting tidbit of the East African Nile crocodile, there's a very large crocodile farm in Arba Minch, Ethiopia, that was one of the earliest crocodile farms established in Africa, and it's been operating for a very, very long time. And that's also, Arba Minch is the headquarters where many of the US military operations in the Middle East are actually headquartered and carried out from Ethiopian soil. So there's been, if you have military friends and family that have done anything in the Middle East, they might have actually been to Arba Minch, Ethiopia. Turtles and tortoises, so the Palamedusids, so we've got 1 species of helmeted terrapin, so that's this guy here on the bottom right, that occurs in Ethiopia. There's 1 species of softshell turtle. This is a very similar turtle to our Florida softshell turtle, so they like sandy bottom rivers. That's pretty much it. They're almost never out of the water unless females are moving to lay their eggs. And then there's 3 species of tortoises. One of the most recognizable is the East African leopard tortoise. And the ones in Ethiopia can reach massive, massive sizes. So these are considered probably the 3rd or 4th largest species of tortoise in the world. But the ones in Ethiopia, of all the African leopard tortoises, these get the biggest. They're absolutely massive. Moving on to lizards. So the group Sauria just refers to lizards with the exclusion of snakes. Agamid lizards, which these are very similar to things like collared lizards that you might find in Western Oklahoma. Western US. There's 18 species in Ethiopia. These are sort of like the iguanas of the old world. They fill a lot of different niches. They're found in lots of different habitats, but oftentimes they're herbivorous. So there's some that are strictly herbivorous, and then sometimes they're a little insectivorous. They'll eat some insects and whatnot. They're sometimes called dragon lizards, and in Ethiopia, they're really heavily associated with rocky habitats. But you can see there's a lot of really cool diversity. So things from really large, streamlined, kind of skinny lizards. These guys are more found in trees, this particular species, with this nice long tail, to then these guys here that have these little tiny stubby tails, almost look like a horny toad. And then these guys are strictly just living under rocks. So they live underneath big rocks and they dig a little burrow and they stick that tail out so that any potential predator that tries to get at them would be getting a tail rather than their head. Chameleons, so this is a family that many people are familiar with, just because they change color. They're very beautiful. They're widely used in advertising in the US, and they're really popular pets. There's 8 species that occur in Ethiopia. Again, most of the species occur in the lowlands, but these 2 species here, so this is the Bale two-horn chameleon, and then this is the Hyena forest chameleon. These are dwarf chameleons that, if you can see my fingers, they're not very big. They're only a couple of inches long. They only occur in the highlands of the Bale Mountains, again, in southeastern Ethiopia, and they don't occur anywhere else in the world. And as far as reptiles in Ethiopia, these attain the highest altitude. So this Hyena forest chameleon, I've found at over 3,000 meters. So literally at night, things freeze and their icicles form in the trees. And in the morning, it's like the icicles thaw and the little chameleons thaw and start moving again. So they can tolerate very, very cold temperatures. Cordylids, there's one endemic species, this Cordylus rive. So these are the armadillo lizards. The South African ones are pretty famous. They bite their tail and roll up into a ball like an armadillo, and they've got all of these osteoderms covering their body that prevents predators from being able to attack them. And then this is a similar lizard, the plated lizards, the Garasaurids. There's 2 species that occur in Ethiopia, but again, these lizards have massive protection all along their bodies with these bony osteoderms, almost like crocodiles. Geckos, one of the most speciose families of lizards. There's 33 described species in Ethiopia. There's certainly probably 20 to 30 additional undescribed species, very, very diverse. The family Geckonidae, which is known as the true geckos. So these are geckos that have toe pads so they can claw on, or climb on slick surfaces, but that they also have claws. There's 1 endemic species to Ethiopia that's currently described. Several others are in preparation. And the most diversity of these geckos is in the Somali arid zone. 2 more additional families of geckos are found in, or 3 more are found in Ethiopia, the eublepharids. So these are the fat-tailed or clawed geckos. These are very popular in the pet trade. So leopard geckos are a type of eublepharid gecko. If you're in West Texas or the Western United States, banded geckos are also a eublepharid gecko. There's not a lot of diversity in the New World, but in the Old World, there's a lot of diversity. The spherulodactylids, so that's what one of these guys is. They're these very small, really fast-moving geckos that typically are associated with rocky habitats. And then the wall geckos, the phylodactyds, this big guy right here. They're very similar looking to true geckos. 1 additional species of lizards, the lacertids. These are like the old world whiptails. So we have whiptail 6-lined race runners here in Florida. This is a different family, but this is what niche this family fills. There's about 16 species of in Ethiopia. Again, most diversity is in the lowlands, but there's certainly a lot of undescribed diversity. So this particular picture is an undescribed lacertid from eastern Ethiopia. Skinks, so these are very common here in Tallahassee. We've got several species of skinks that you almost certainly see almost on a daily basis if you're looking around. They're very adaptable to human habitats, so gardens, fence posts, things like that. There's over 20 species found in Ethiopia. These are known, this entire family is characterized by its reduced limbs. So most skinks have long snake-like bodies and little tiny arms and legs. There's 1 described species that is certainly endemic to Ethiopia. There's several other species that are probably only occur in Ethiopia. We just don't know a lot about some of them. And then for the giants of the lizard family, the varanid lizards, there's 2 species. So we have the savanna monitor here on the right, and then the Nile monitor. And both of these species are very widespread throughout the Ethiopian lowlands. Moving on to snakes, the blind snakes. So these are snakes that have very, very reduced eyes, almost no vision. We have several species that occur in Florida, both introduced and native. But in Ethiopia, there's 2 families, so the Leptotyphloptidae, so there's 3 species. These are called the thread snakes sometimes. And this is the only family that we have in the United States of blind snakes that's native. We have 1 introduced species of Typhlops that is the other family that's very widespread in the tropical regions, so both in the New World and in the Old World. And within Ethiopia, there's 7 species of Typhlops. Boas and pythons, there's 2 species of boa that occur. So both of these species of boa are sand boas. So we have a common sand boa, and then also the Somali sand boa, which is very, very rare within Ethiopia, but much more common in Somalia. And then there's 1 species of python, so the East African rock python. The most diverse family within Ethiopia are the colubrids. So these are the very common snakes. Again, the most diverse family here in the United States as well. So in the US and here in Florida, these are all of our racers, our water snakes, these kind of things. Typically non-venomous, or if they are venomous, it's very mild, not very medically significant bites. In the United States, in Africa, some of these colubrids actually have extremely medically significant bites. Within Ethiopia, there's only 1 colubrid that has an extremely medically significant bite, but there's 18 species. And again, here, even though the highest diversity is in the lowlands, colubrids reach the highest elevation of any snake in Ethiopia, along with this next family I'm going to talk about, or I'll talk about in a second, because nature scenes, there's 2 species. These are the water snakes. And so we have water snakes here too that are in this same family, typically doing the same thing. But the Lamprophiids, this is an endemic family, or excuse me, there's an endemic genus within this family only found in Ethiopia. And these reach the highest elevation, I believe, of any snake in Africa. There's about 30 species within Ethiopia, 4 endemic species and 1 endemic genus. And again, lots of diversity here. You have things with large eyes, pointy snouts. This fits the same ecological niche as racers here in Florida, or coach whips out west. We've got things that look very similar. These are African house snakes that look very similar to rat snakes here, for example. And then we have striped Samophines that look very similar and fill the same niche as our garter snakes, just a different family. Moving on to what are typically the medically significant snakes within Ethiopia as far as venomous snakes go, we have 3 families. So the Atractaspids, so these are the mole vipers. There's 9 species that occur in Ethiopia. Elapids, these are cobras and mambas. So we have cobras here, 8 species. And then vipers, there are 7 species with 1, actually 2 now that are endemic. I need to update that slide. So, and for those of you that haven't seen a cobra that doesn't look like this, when it has its hood erect, cobras, whenever they're not agitated and they're not displaying, they look pretty much like a typical snake. That hood is not always spread out like you see in the photos. That's only whenever they feel threatened or that they're agitated that they actually inflate that hood. Typically, it's held at the sides of their neck and they look just like any other snake. As far as conservation concerns in Ethiopia with reptiles, many species, particularly within snakes, are only known from a few records. So we really don't have a good idea of how many individuals there are of any given species, because many of the regions are just very under-collected. So very few researchers have worked there for a long time, and very few collections have been made to actually have an assessment. Less than 50 species are listed on the IUCN Red List, and all of the species are considered either least concern or data deficient. So least concern means that's the lowest status that the lowest threat status that the IUCN issues, or data deficient just means that they haven't been assessed. So there's 21 species that are listed on CITES, which is actually a different regulatory body. And so this is the Committee on International Trade in Endangered Species. These are all listed as Appendix 2. And they're basically listed for any species that there is a commercial use or purpose for. So I'm going to try to circle here. So this thing, like tortoise shells that are used to make traditional drums, or reptile skins that are used to make jewelry, or crocodiles, for example, that have been farmed for many, many years. Their leather is used in a variety of goods. And when CITES lists a species, this just means that it does have a commercial purpose. And so we need to monitor the number of individuals that are being used. And so Appendix 2 basically means that these are not a serious threat, but we need to keep track of the numbers. So just to summarize a bit of the herpetofaunal diversity within Ethiopia, there's 265, actually closer to 270 now, described species from over 40 families. Amphibians have the highest amount of endemism, with over 40% of those species found nowhere else but Ethiopia. Reptiles have about 10% endemism, but if you consider the ecological zone, the Somali arid region, which also is shared with Somalia and Somaliland, nearly 40% of lizards are endemic. And so there's certainly a lot of undescribed diversity, just because of the lack of research that's been done in the area. And the majority of species, the conservation status is just simply unknown. So moving on to the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about some of the research that I've done personally in Ethiopia since 2012. And I'll start off with this little map that I made of my trips from 2012 to 2015. So if there's a star on the map, that meant that I lived in the field in that particular area for at least 20 days, at least one time. Most of these were multiple trips that were closer to 30 days, where it was just me and my field gear, and perhaps a local guide or someone as a local contact. But basically me just camping, collecting data on the reptiles and amphibians in the area. And then each one of these other big blue stars are just major field sites that were for my PhD research, or other ongoing research where I stopped and made significant collections. So the majority of the country is covered. Where I've spent the least amount of time is actually the eastern and northwestern regions of Ethiopia. But there's a reason for this. This is actually where there's a large population, and there's historically been a lot of travel to these regions of Ethiopia. So these were actually the best known regions whenever I started working there. So with the exception of one regional state right over here that borders with Sudan, I've visited and done fieldwork in every region of Ethiopia. I know this is a very wordy slide, but I just wanted to point out some of my interests within Ethiopian herpetology and some of the ongoing work that I've done, things that are ongoing. So, and to give credit to some of the agencies that have been so gracious as to fund my work. So during my PhD, I was very interested in community assembly of Ethiopian snakes. And so I was looking at how Ethiopian snake communities change as you change in elevation, because again, as I pointed out in the beginning of the talk, there's a lot of topographical diversity. And so that's what actually funded my Fulbright fellowship to Ethiopia. I was also interested in, and continue to be interested in, how the gut bacteria of Ethiopian reptiles influence their ecology and evolution. This was a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation. Just diversification across the Great Rift Valley. So I was interested in how this topographical diversity actually impacts how species evolve. And then I've had some work just purely based on trying to find and describe new species, so species discovery projects that were funded by the Percy Sladen Memorial Fund. Some of the projects that I've been able to be involved with and start with Ethiopian researchers and undergraduate researchers here in the US is using environmental DNA to detect some of these rare amphibians, so these highland amphibians that haven't been seen in decades. There are molecular techniques that we can now use to see if we can detect their DNA just in the water or in the environment. If we can't actually find the physical frog, can we see if there's traces of the frog in the environment to see if they're still around, and we might just be looking in the wrong areas or at the wrong times of year. Also using molecular tools to characterize diets in Ethiopian amphibian communities. So I've had undergraduates that have taken the stomachs out of frogs and classified all of the individual diet items that they can find, working with entomologists to actually ID all of the different species of bugs and invertebrates that are found in the stomach. And then we also use DNA techniques to extract the DNA from those contents and see if we can identify if there's more or less species that we can identify using DNA versus just looking at things under a microscope. In partnership with the Ethiopian Public Health Authority, I lost my cursor, this gentleman over here that I'm standing with, Geshal Geberwald, we've started to develop an in-country anti-venom production and storage facility in Addis Ababa as part of the Ethiopian Public Health Authority's umbrella, because currently snakebite, which is a major public health concern, is one of the top neglected tropical diseases according to the World Health Organization. It's a big problem in rural Ethiopia too, and there's currently no actual in-country production of antivenom. So all the antivenom that's administered in Ethiopia is extremely expensive and has to be imported from either France or South Africa. I'm very interested in taxonomy, so describing new species that I encounter in Ethiopia. And then most recently, I've started a project in collaboration with the St. Louis Zoo on the conservation of Ethiopian mountain adders. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And I'm going to try to quickly go through here. I realize it's probably just an hour and we're running out of time. So fieldwork in Ethiopia is not always easy. I've had many vehicles, been involved in many accidents, many breakdowns. And just to point out, I always hire drivers in Ethiopia, so it's typically, it's actually never been me driving, but this is challenging anywhere. But in Ethiopia, for some reason, car trouble seems to be a massive issue. I think one statistic that I heard was that there are more vehicular fatalities per capita in Ethiopia than anywhere else in the world. I don't know if that's actually true. But so all this field work's only really possible with all the great team members that I've been able to partner up with. Pretty much everywhere where I'm staying with an extended period of time for greater than 30 days, I try to hire local guides, local cooks, local people to help me with my research that I can then also train and teach how to trap and study these reptiles and amphibians. And I've had a number of really great collaborators and field assistants come join me in the field over the years, from Peace Corps volunteers to other US and other scientists from around the world. And then sometimes their pets help me too. So this dog actually helped me collect a snake unintentionally. I think he thought it was a meal, but it wound up being a collection for me. Lots of beautiful camps. So I've been very fortunate to be able to do this research in very, very beautiful areas. I'm always sleeping in a hammock, and I try to set my hammocks up with the nicest views. Whenever I go and conduct a field study, just so you know what the sampling is like, I'm usually using drift fences and pitfall traps. And so animals, reptiles and amphibians come along. These are non-invasive, non-lethal traps. So they hit the fence and they have to go one direction or the other, and they either get caught in a funnel or they fall into a bucket. I check these traps multiple times a day. And then individuals that are collected, I record data from them. And then a certain number of individuals are preserved and retained for museum collections that go into natural history museums, both in Ethiopia and in the US. These samples, like I said, I'm typically taking voucher specimens for museums. I'm taking tissue samples for DNA analysis, bacterial samples for DNA analysis, venom samples, and then I'm collecting ecological data and data on the morphology and physiology of all of the animals that I'm collecting. So these are very general surveys. Some of the work that I've been involved with and led regarding species discovery. So far, we've rediscovered 2 endemic species to Ethiopia, that each of which had not been seen for more than 30 years. One of these is the Ethiopian girdled lizards here in this publication picture, so Cordylus reevi. Multiple species that I've been able to collect. I've been the second or third person that's ever recorded them before. And I've been fortunate to be involved in 7 species described as brand new to science from Ethiopia. And there's several more that we're working on. And again, whenever I say that I'm the person that's only collected these for the second time, I want to make full acknowledgement that this is most likely, I'm the second Western scientist, trained herpetologist that has collected these species. Everywhere I go, the local people that I'm working with, they know what's there. They know these species very well. They encounter them all the time. It's just that oftentimes researchers are not going there to actually document them. Again, this is the other species, Tychodina hirene, which is the second of the 2 species that I was involved in the rediscovery of that hadn't been seen in many years. 2 species of skinks that we've described. One just came out a couple of weeks ago, so Panaspis anetsabini is a new species that's endemic to Ethiopia. This is a snake-eyed skink. Apologies, my daughter just tried to walk in. And these skinks are very interesting because they lack eyelids, so they have an ablepharine eye like a snake. And then this one here on the right is another new species from Ethiopia that we're currently working on the description of. I think I mentioned earlier, this lacertid here, this Phylochortus, is a new species of lizard that we're describing from southeastern Ethiopia. I wanted to make mention, I've talked about the viper projects that I'm working with the St. Louis Zoo. So this is a new species that's endemic to the Bale Mountains of Ethiopia, Betis hirene. Prior to this picture being taken in 2014 by an ornithologist friend of mine, this species had not ever been documented alive. There had been several specimens sent to the Natural History Museum in London and in the Natural History Museum in Germany. And it was suspected that this was a new species, but it hadn't actually been documented where they came from. And then this ornithologist was fortunate to be able to get this picture. He happened to be with my driver that I used at the same time when I was doing my reptile surveys, and they knew that I was looking for this particular species in the area. And this led to a team of us actually describing this as a new species. But part of the problem with this is a very underdocumented species. It's incredibly rare. The same year that we published this paper, there were individuals from Europe that are involved in the pet trade that went to go and collect it. And so they also had pictures that they were able to take and potentially collections made of this very rare species. And as you can see in the background, the only way you find this species is by very, very massively damaging the habitat. So you can just see how chopped down the forest is, and it's actually sitting on a log that must have been cut down to find it. So lots of destruction to the habitat just to detect them because they're particularly rare, and they're extremely vulnerable to collection for the pet trade. So this is one of the reasons that the St. Louis Zoo and I are partnering up to work on the conservation of this species. And then lastly, the one project I'm going to wrap up with talking to you about tonight is looking at diversification across the Great Rift Valley. So I mentioned these African rocket frogs that have a lot of diversity within Ethiopia. My undergraduate that I was working with during my Ph.D., Megan Smith, who just recently received her doctorate from Ohio State University, was interested in looking at these frogs. And she noticed that there were a lot of populations that either occurred on the east or the west side of the Great Rift Valley. And so each one of these lines in this phylogeny is just a representation of the genetic distances between these different populations of what were described as 1 or 2 species. And then she's mapped where they occur. And so we started looking at this at a little closer. Again, here are phylogenetic trees. So this is a representation of DNA sequences of how these individuals are related to one another. And she found that, and they're color coded by the population that they're most closely related to. And then she's plotted these here in Ethiopia. And she noticed that they had very distinct geographic groupings, and they weren't necessarily matching up with what was described. So here, for just a quick example, you see that Tychodina cooperi here is most closely related to Tychodina pneumoni 5 in this phylogeny, but over here, Tychodina cooperi, well, actually, it's also most closely related to Tychodina pneumoni 5 in this one. But regardless, they didn't actually match up. There's many more populations that are described as Tychodina pneumoni than just the single species representation that we had. And so this led Megan to do some additional really, really fine work and publish her work in the Royal Society in 2016, where she showed in this paper, in this phylogeny, that many of these species actually diversified and split off on this phylogeny during the time of from the late Miocene into the early Pleistocene, when the Ethiopian highlands were uplifting. So from 8 million to about 2 million years ago was when a lot of these populations started diverging and evolving to be different species, essentially. And so we were fortunate within this paper to describe several of these, actually 5 of these, as new species. I've put 4 of them here. So 2 of these are endemic to Ethiopian highlands, so Tychodina goweri and Tychodina levanorum. And then 2 of the new species that we were able to describe are endemic to the Ethiopian lowlands, Tychodina varoensis and Tychodina nurensis. And what we found was, what Megan really found, is that even though these frogs look very, very similar, what she very eloquently described in the paper is that each one of these different species has a different elevational range. So they are basically separated very well by what elevation they occur at and the type of habitat they occur at, in combination with which side of the Great Rift Valley they are on. So Tychodina armorensis, that occurs in montane streams and grasslands, it's only found in highlands west of the Great Rift Valley. But then other species that are occupying montane grasslands might be found on both sides or only east of the Great Rift Valley. And depending on what elevation and altitude you're at, even though all these frogs look very similar, they're not actually exchanging genes and breeding with each other because they're separated either by elevation or the Great Rift Valley. And just to wrap things up here, this was one of the great things that I love about taxonomy is that, you know, when you place a name on a new species, it's very important that name carries forward for generations. And so I was very fortunate to spend a significant amount of time in the Gambella region of Ethiopia with the Nuer people on the Baro River. And so this frog, this new species, was collected by me on the Baro River. And so we named it after that geographic feature. But then in addition to that, the people, the local people, which is the Nuer tribe, welcomed me into their homes, welcomed me to their communities, and shared very, very rich traditions with me. This is a picture of each year at the end of the dry season. These very small lakes form as the river dries up, and the communities from all around for hundreds of kilometers come to feed themselves and do spearfishing in these lakes, and they invited me to join in on this, and this is a very amazing experience for me. And this frog is, even though it's more widespread within Ethiopia, was first discovered by me in this region, and in memorarium to that, we decided to name this particular species after the Nuer tribe of Western Ethiopia. So just to summarize, I know I've gone a little over time here, but I hope you've enjoyed it. So Ethiopia is known as the land of the people, but it actually has a very rich, high faunal diversity as well. Lots of endemism in the reptiles and amphibians. Many of these species are under threat, but most importantly, many of these species are just not very well studied. They're under threat to biopiracy, so people taking them without permission, people exploiting them without the proper permits, illegal collecting for pet trade and commerce. But largely, this is just a product of not enough representation or government oversight, and not enough researchers actually interested in this area. And I hope that is beginning to change, and I hope it continues to change, because it's a fascinating place to live and to work. So I need to acknowledge all of my funding sources. So the Fulbright and National Science Foundations, most of all, the Valley Mountain Lodge that hosted me many times and provided funding for some of my field work, multiple universities, lots of collaborators, and I have so many people to thank for field work, help in the field. And so with that, I can take questions if there's any time and anyone would like to share a cocktail and ask any questions. But
I had a question, but that's just, I mean, if nobody else does.
So it says, so there's so much that's been researched anthropologically. Why do you think so little research has been done zoologically, or at least herpetologically? So zoologically, not necessarily. There's been a lot of mammal research in Ethiopia. There's some very, very, very fine mammalogists and very, very fine ichthyologists. But with the exception of crocodiles and some turtles, there is not a lot of large-scale commercial value to reptiles that occur in Ethiopia. And oftentimes in developing countries, the science follows where you can get money and where you can get funding to do that. And in developing countries, it's often, is there a commercial value aspect to it? And so there's little commercial value aspect to studying reptiles. So for the actual Ethiopian researchers, it's very hard for them, even though I've met very many people that are interested in the reptiles that are Ethiopians that work at the universities there, it's hard for them to get funding to do it. And then other than that, as far as other researchers coming to Ethiopia, it's historically been a difficult place to work. There's a lot of red tape. I attribute a little bit of it to that. Certainly not a lack of interest. I'm by no means one of the first people that know that this is a very interesting area to study reptiles, but a lot of red tape, but there's a lot of challenges.
Okay. Any other questions?
All right.
Oh, we have one on the, wait, we've got one under the Q&A over here. Did you capture that viper and take it to the zoo?
No, the last one that I was talking about, no, that was, so the only live specimens of that I know that anyone have caught might have been smuggled to Europe. I have not actually collected a live one of that last specimen, but that's what the St. Louis Zoo and I are hoping to do. We are actually hoping to get some funding to go and collect some and not take them back to the zoo, but we would actually like to put radio transmitters on them and get some local Ethiopian herpetologists to study them and follow them in nature so that we can learn more about their ecology.
Okay, Phyllis, you got your hand up. You're gonna have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm clicking on the Q&A, but I don't see anything.
Okay, go ahead, Phyllis.
What do you suggest Florida does about the pythons that are destroying our species?
The pythons in South Florida?
Yes.
There are, so I do not work specifically with those, but there are multiple government agencies from the U.S. Geological Survey and U.S. Fish and Wildlife that work with those. I will say that the pythons are likely here to stay, from what I understand. They're very well established in South Florida. They're not going to spread throughout the U.S., as some people have misreported. There's only a very limited area in South Florida and some places in South Texas, if they happen to be there, that they can survive year-round and from year to year. But it's just a new species that we have to learn to manage. It's just like Eurasian carp in our waterways, and yeah, corbiculus snails in all of our rivers. They're an invasive species that have got here, and where they have a foothold, we just have to learn to manage them.
Okay, anybody else? Nope.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Colston.
Thank you.
And it looks like we're done. All right, next week we've got Dr. Andrew Frank coming in to talk to us from Florida State University about the 10 things you never wanted to know, or probably maybe thought you know. We've got another question, sorry.
Oh.
Nope, that's the same one. Okay.
Okay.
Dr. Frank is going to be talking to us about the 10 things you thought you knew about Seminoles that maybe you thought you knew, but you really didn't, or possibly you always, what am I trying to say? The 10 things you thought you knew that you probably don't. So join us next week. Again, we will be having cocktails with Madison Social, and they will be having signature cocktails. I'm not sure what they're going to be called yet, but please stop by there before 5 o'clock and check it out. Oh, and thank you again for joining us. Oh, we got another question. Oh, Jane, thank you for joining us. And we will see you next week. So much appreciate your assistance this week, Dr. Colston. I loved it, but I'm into herps, so I'm a weirdo. But we will see you next time. Thank you, and have a great week.
You too.